Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. And it's great to be here at the end of this 4 week sermon Sunday series on disconnection. A couple months ago, when I got to go to Craig Regional Park with Pastor Jay Lee, and we just took a big walk all the way around the park, got about 10,000 steps in the process, and we were brainstorming different sermon series that we might go into this coming year. And we felt like this topic of disconnection would be a good one to start us off, just because we were all kind of experiencing and feeling it in different ways, and in different dimensions. And we even back then we had an inkling that this was going to be a series that really was relevant to many of us, but I think we weren't able to imagine just the degree to which people have responded, the degree to which people have related to all the things that we've talked about. And what we did when we originally kind of planned and architected this series was we felt like sometimes when we preach on a topic, it just feels very rushed, where we kind of just go, bam, one, two, three, and then we kind of jump straight into another topic. And instead, this time we felt like we really wanted to honor the space that the Lord opened up, and to devote a whole entire week at the end for us to consolidate and reflect and further discuss all the things that were talked about in the last 3 weeks. And even just watching that video with snippets of Matt and Jay and myself, just kind of realizing, appreciating just how substantive, how heavy, and how much information was packed into those 3 weeks, and how many different of all the different ways that we can be reflecting and challenged by that. So to that end, this morning we're going to experiment with a new format of kind of the Sunday sermon. And instead of just having one individual share, we're going to bring back the three of us with Matt and Jay and myself. And if we were doing this live, we'd be sitting in chairs all together up on stage, but we'll kind of try to recreate that here on Zoom land. What we're going to do is we are going to discuss a few opening questions, follow-up questions from our last 3 weeks, and just have a conversation among the three of us. And as we do this, I'd love for you to eventually join into this conversation and join into this discussion. We have some breakout questions at the end, and part of the breakout questions is an invitation for you all to not only share some of your own reactions and reflections during the last month, but also to see if you have any follow-up questions for any of us. So, some of this is going to be kind of ad hoc, and we're going to kind of go with the flow, and some of it is going to be a little bit prepared, but and if this format works out well, we might end up doing this a little bit more. I think something that we really value here at our church is a diversity of voices, and kind of the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, and hopefully this format might be conducive to something like that. So let me start off this discussion with the following question, starting with Pastor Jay's initial talk on reconnection with God. So Pastor Jay, I know during that first week of the series, you shared a number of really thoughtful reasons why people might feel disconnected with God, especially during this past year. And what I'd love to do is just invite the two of you, and I'll join in here as well. I'd love to hear more about how perhaps the two of you might have experienced disconnection with God personally, and how you are either still working through it or have worked through this disconnection even right now.
Sure. Yeah, so I think the question is difficult. Admittedly, because not even just talking about a relationship with God, but how do you assess the level of connection and closeness that you have in any relationship with anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to put a level on it, like, oh, we're at a 5, or we're at a 2, or we're at a 3. So, to some degree, it's just difficult to assess at all. And so, I don't want to get too informational, but like I kind of, in kind of trying to process this question, the first thought that I had was, yeah, how do do you assess the level of closeness or connection you have with Jesus in the first place? And I kind of started with, okay, first let's kind of eliminate the things, what's not a measure of the connection that we have with God. And the first thing was, it's not a measure necessarily of like, the level of like ecstatic feelings or like, you know raw emotions that come out of us. That's not necessarily a measure of the connection, right? That I kind of call it the passion curve, where in any relationship you start with a very high level of passion, right? Like any relationship you've ever had, and then it kind of normals out. Like maybe in a relationship where you're not constantly having to talk to each other for hours every night, and you're not constantly having to, like, I can't eat or sleep because I'm just thinking about this person that I love. Like you can't live like that long term, right? Well, none of us will be able to sustain a job, and it kind of levels out. But and then there's kind of this long kind of sort of a quiet knowing, long passion in the same direction for this person. And a lot of those days can look very mundane and very just kind of normal days. And so it's not kind of ecstatic feelings or emotional like fervor. It's not even miraculous manifestations. Like if I'm really close to God, then all these miraculous things are coming out of my life. And the thing that I always go back to is John the Baptist, because, it says that John the Baptist did no miracle. And I always key on that because it makes me feel better about myself, because Jay Lee also does no miracles. And so, that's not necessarily a measure of our closeness or our connection with God either. And so, so the thing that I always go back to is that, it tells us that the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of having the Spirit of Jesus living within us is, joy, love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, humility, and self-control. And that, to me, I think that's the closest thing that we have to some sort of gauge of how we're doing, and everything else in our spiritual lives flows out of that, right? Everything else that we do, all the ways that we serve or whatever, the good works that we do, all of those things flow out of that fruit of the Spirit that's living within us, faith, hope, and love. And so kind of going back to your initial question, Dave, like, how have I been kind of navigating? I think early pandemic for me was more dealing with kind of just managing my stress. Maybe it was kind of the allowing myself to sort of grieve, even though I didn't realize that I was grieving, and kind of battling against the feeling and the impulse inside of me that I wasn't like doing enough. Like, man, I should be doing more, right? Like we have all the time in the world, and there's so many needs, there's so many people who are hurting. I could be doing so much, right? And I could be getting involved in so much, And so the early pandemic, I think, was me managing being okay with just, it's also okay just to kind of get through this, right? And to be okay just being at home with my family, be at home trying to manage my own stress and my anxiety that had been, really flaring up, especially early in the pandemic. I noticed though, kind of late pandemic, like where we're at now, it sort of flipped where um, I've just happened to be a lot busier now, like with, doing, ministry stuff and, different things coming up, people
Thank you,
asking
by
me
the
to
way.
do different things. So, there's been a lot more going on. And I think that it sort of flipped where now it's me kind of recognizing like, hey, I'm busy doing all these things, right? Serving, doing all these things for the Lord, but like, how's the fruit of the Spirit in my life? Like,
Mhm.
it's like, man, I am I as joyful? Is this disrupting my joy? Is this disrupting my peace? Like, I noticed lately it's like I'm a lot grouchier at home, or a lot less patient with like Evie and stuff like that. And so it's like, okay, I mean, obviously there's different ebbs and flows, and there's different periods of more and less busyness in our lives, but just recognizing this is not a place to live, right? If it's disrupting the fruits of the Spirit in my everyday life and interactions, like this is not a good place to live, and I need to recognize that. So yeah, I mean, I just kind of spit all that out, but that's some of the way that I've been sort of trying to manage this.
That's really good stuff, Pastor Jay. And I think, if you ask my family members, the fruit of Dave's spirit was this past week has been, grumpiness, irritability, and lack of patience, and, a real long list of other adjectives. And I really also like the that topic of that you spoke on earlier about, our feelings of God's presence, um, and that kind of reminds me of a lot of uh, a lot of readings of the writings of some old English Puritans, and they used to make a distinction between heat versus light. That sometimes God shows up and we can kind of sense him through our vision, like through that one sense, and we see him as light. And at other times, we may not be able to use and sense his presence in the same way through our sight, but instead we can feel his presence through a different approach, through a different sense, like maybe through our touch. And we feel his heat, and I feel like for me, a lot of navigating this season of COVID has been about being flexible and about pivoting, because there's a lot of traditional ways that we're used to connecting with God. Like we're used to connecting with God and as with Him as light, through a certain kind of sense that we're used to, maybe through worship, through fellowship. But when those things are taken away, it's not that this is the only way that we can feel God's presence. We just have to pivot to another sense, pivot to another kind of approach. And I think in the long run, if we navigate this well, this is actually a really helpful ability to develop, to be able to feel God's presence and sense God's presence and follow him through multiple approaches. It doesn't have to be the same time over and over and over again. In fact, that's, I believe, is a sign of spiritual maturity. I have a lot more to say about this, but let me pause here. And I'd love to invite Brother Matt into this conversation. How have you been experiencing kind of disconnection with God? How have you been kind of working through that lately?
I feel like it's kind of ironic because my disconnection is actually, I feel like it's deeply rooted in the way that I grew up in the church. Because what happens for me is that I kind of go back to that whole prosperity gospel that I was kind of raised sort of in, the things that I learned as a young Christian, a young person going to church. And so when things get really tough, like for this year has been really tough, 2020 for everyone, right? But just personally, I get to the point where my job, I've been a teacher for 20 years, and this year felt like I was a first year teacher because everything changed. I had to prepare everything differently, and it took so much time and so much effort. And then you see, like you said, our healthcare workers who are just bombarded with all these new things that they're trying to deal with. And so what happens is I start to get to that point where I'm like, man, I've been a pretty good person. I've tried to follow God pretty well. Like, why is everything so hard? Shouldn't this be a lot easier? And so at that point, when I fall back into that, that's when my disconnection starts to happen, because I start thinking about like, oh, look at all the things I've done shouldn't this be taken care of at this point? Shouldn't this pandemic be over? Shouldn't it not be affecting me? Like those kind of like false things that kind of creep into my mind, which has led to me this whole big deconstruction journey that Vanessa and I have been on, trying to figure things out. But I think what happens is when I go back to those places of prosperity and things should be like this, I've gone away from the fact that that I've missed out on what the word actually is. Like, because when you go back to the word, you're going back to Jesus. That's what it is. And so to go back to Jesus and be like, what does Jesus have to say about this? What is actual truth? And I find out, which is sort of a bummer, that if I want to live my life, if I want my life, I want to save my life, I actually have to lose it. And I have to, instead of be thinking about all these things that are going to benefit me, what do I need to do? What do I need to give away? How am I being generous right now? Because when I look at Jesus is all about generosity. How am I being a peacemaker right now? Because when I look at Jesus, he's all about being a peacemaker. And all of these things that I need to step into that I've lost sight of, which, like I said, is ironic because it's all the things that I was kind of like was put into my mind as a young person that I've tried to like now having to like pick up and put aside to try to step into the ways of actually following Jesus. And so for me, it's that tension between those two things that I have to wrestle with. And it seems like during this last season of pandemic, I've had to do a lot of wrestling with that just because of the way that things have not gone the way that I wanted them to go. And so, yeah, a lot of those things that you guys were just talking about totally resonate with that as well.
Man, that's such good stuff, Matt. And I feel like just as you're saying that even though you've been teaching for so long, this last year, it feels like you're a first year teacher again. I think in many ways, it's fair to say just as many of us have been Christians for a while, it also feels like we're kind of Christians all over again during this last year, figuring out the basic stuff. And a little bit of a plug. I know this next series that Pastor Elliott's going to lead us through is going to be on going back to the basics, because a lot of us are kind of needing to do that, and we have been doing that in the last year. And man, one of the things I really connect with what you shared about is how having also grown up in this kind of evangelical prosperity gospel kind of ether, there's this it really reinforces this sense of just world, just world hypothesis. And the idea behind that is, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And if I kind of, fill in the equation, play this game well and do the right things, like pray and do everything that the church asked me to do and what I think God is asking me to do, there's almost like a sense of entitlement, like, God, I expect things to go well for me, and when things don't, and most of the time they don't, there's almost this frustration and anger with God, and we don't really know what to do with it, where the prosperity gospel gets us to this point of like tension, but it doesn't really give us much in terms of how to resolve this tension. So we're kind of wallowing in this anger towards God that really comes from, in my case at least, I'm not saying for you, like a sense of entitlement that really came from, I think, a misguided theology. But we should probably preach on this sometime in the future, but I think this is something we can all kind of relate to. Jake, did you want to jump in too real quick?
Maybe I was just throwing a couple of practical things, like, because I think for me, I wouldn't say I come from a legalistic background, but maybe one that could lean a little bit legalistic. And I think an important distinction to make here is, because we don't want to say that these spiritual disciplines and reading our Bibles and praying every day or whatever, like that they're not important, but just making the distinction between the relationship and the context for relationship, right? And that they're not necessarily the same thing, that my relationship with God is not what I do and how much I read the Bible or how much I know the Bible, how much I pray. The relationship is something else. The relationship is just, because again, like any other relationship, it's something that's somewhat below recognition or able to describe exactly, right? It's something internal, maybe more like the fruits of the Spirit, but these things are contexts for relationship and means for relation, means for me to be able to have greater communication with Jesus, to speak unspoken, issues that I have or questions that I have, to spend time with him, to, get to know his heart, to see his heart, right? And so all of these things are means, and that's why they're important, but they aren't the relationship. The relationship is something else that is, that these means, these contexts help develop. And so just to be able to try to parse that out in our minds is important, so that we don't kind of skew into the legalistic way of thinking.
Yeah. And one of the points from your message like 3 weeks ago that I still remember is that analogy of that dude or gal that you hang out in a group with, but you actually don't really know them very well. Like, it would be a little awkward if you're used to them being in part of your social groups and hangout groups, but it'd be kind of weird if you just spend individual time with them because you don't actually know them. So I think that's a great illustration of having a lot of context with somebody, but not actually having much of a relationship with them, and how God oftentimes can fit into that for us. Well, let's pivot to the next question. I think we're only going to have time for 2 questions today, which is, or 2 topics of discussion, which is totally cool. I think this has already been really interesting and really enjoying it. The second question has to do with maybe a question that many of us are thinking about, like, well, now that we're getting used to doing, church online, on Facebook, on Zoom, and it's super convenient because I don't even have to do it on Sunday mornings. I can do it anytime I want. I can do it on my phone, and and I bet people are wondering, like, even when COVID improves, the situation enables us to meet in person, even when COVID kind of passes. Like, why should we bother being part of a physical church anymore when I can just do church on YouTube? And and if I really want good worship, then I'll just go on YouTube and listen to some professional worship band lead, and I'll just worship there and listen to a message. Like why even bother reconnecting with a physical church when I can just do it online forever? How would you guys respond to that question?
Well, I mean, it's a fair question, right? But I think from what I learned, especially when I got to teach a couple of weeks ago about the church, I think that we have podcasts and that we have YouTube to be able to learn from. I think those are actually really good things. I'm a person that used to listen to a ton of sports talk radio in my car, like every time I drive somewhere. And I've gotten in the last couple of years to this place where I listen to a lot of podcasts instead. And a lot of these things are, and now granted, there's a lot of truth from these things, and there's a lot of non-truths from these things too. So it is like cool to kind of decipher what you're putting in. But at the same time, I think it's really valuable that we have these ways of technology to be able to learn at any time instead of having to wait till Sunday morning to learn. From someone who's studied or someone who has devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, like we talked about, which is all great. But when I was like really studying about that early church in Acts, and I was really like taking some time to understand like what was the whole point of this thing, part of it, yes, was devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, learning the ways of Jesus, which was a big thing, but it was only a 1/4 of what they actually said that the early church was after. And so when you look at some of those other things that the early church was doing, the reasons they were meeting, which was to have fellowship with one another, which was the koinonia piece. If you were able to listen a few weeks ago, we talked about koinonia being more than just hanging out. Fellowship, that word fellowship is so churchy. And it's just like, oh, when you have a meal with some people that also believe in Jesus, and then at the end of the night, you're like, that was some great fellowship. And just such a weird word for me.
But we really just hung out. There really wasn't Jesus in it necessarily.
Yeah, we're gonna throw fellowship in there. But the way that that's described in the Greek is all about something inside of you that has to share, that has to be able to give yourself away to other people for the prosperity of other people. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, right? But I feel like the only way we can learn, and I think, Dave, this is a piece of the formation that you often talk about, but the only way we can learn to do that well is to do that in a community with one another. And I feel like there's really specific ways of doing that, because I've been to churches before that are like the mega churches where I can sneak in the back row and sit and listen to a word and then sneak out. But I don't think there's a ton of formation going on there, because I didn't find ways to share, to bear with one another in our burdens, to celebrate with one another, to cry with one another. I didn't have that. And so I think my formation was missing out. What I believe, when we come together and we actually meet, we have the opportunity to one, get to know each other and get to know each other's needs and get to know the burdens that one another are carrying. But two, then I get to step in and have this piece of my formation to share with other people. And I think that at One Life City Church, we don't do everything perfectly. I'm not saying that we do, but I have seen this. I have seen ways when people, I just remember times when people have having this stuff stolen from them. And so we as a church gathered together and we're like, how can we help this person out by giving to them what they need? Something that I'm a 6 on the Enneagram. So I often think about worst case scenarios, which sometimes it's good because you prepare for stuff, but other times it's just probably exhausting for my wife. I feel kind of bad. But so I think about worst case scenarios. And sometimes I do think like, what if something happened to me? What if something happened to me and my wife and my kids were left on their own? For me, because I'm a part of this community, I don't worry about them being taken care of, because I know without a doubt, my community, my expression of the church here at One Life City, they are going to take care of my wife and kids. There's no doubt about that, because that's what the church does. And to have that assurance across the board for everyone who comes and gathers and meets together and we be a part of each other's lives, to absolutely know that because of koinonia, because of the grace of God that compels us to share what we have, that we are going to take care of one another. And that's not something that you get from a YouTube video. That's not something you get from a podcast during the week. So that piece of being able to share with one another, to bear with each other's burdens, all that kind of stuff, that's things you can't get when you're not involved in a community and when you're not actively being in formation, which is pointing you towards emulating that of Jesus. And so I think that that's a big thing for me. And one more thing I'll share about that too, if you don't
mind. You're on a roll, go, dude.
And I think we get to talk about this later in the year when we talk more about the church. But one thing that the early church did too was the breaking of bread, which we see as just eating together, which is awesome. Like Elliot was saying earlier during worship, you want to get together, you want to eat some food together. That's perfect. That's great. That's a great way to connect. But when we look at what the early church and what actually the ancient people did in this time period, first century Palestine, when you ate with someone, it was a big deal, and it was about acceptance, to accept people into your circles. If you're coming to my house to eat with me, then there's an acceptance there. I don't care about all these other things that are going on. I'm accepting you as a person into my community. And I think especially now when we have all of this polarizing stuff going on in our world with politics and race relations and all these things, that the church can be a place where we can be like, hey, you know what? I accept you. You are an image bearer. I want to be able to hang out with you, to be with you, no matter what. You are beautifully made in the image of God. So therefore, I accept you. I want you to come in. I think One Life City has also done a good job of being like intentional about, we want different kinds of people to come and join us. We want to be a diverse church. We want to learn from other people who are different. I want to learn from people who grew up differently than the way I grew up.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important piece of our formation too, that again, you cannot have that if you sit by yourself. If you're watching a YouTube video, you don't get that real life experience. And that's part of the kingdom of God. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. And it doesn't look just like me. So if I'm just with me all the time, I'm not experiencing all the things that Jesus is telling me I can experience if I jump into this kingdom way of living.
Oh, that's good stuff, Matt. And also, I mean, if our faith was just about information, I mean, when you think of the media and we're reading articles written by people on the left, people on the right, it's very one-sided. It's designed to convince you or reinforce a certain position without looking at things fairly. And if our formation is based on that kind of information, it's not going to be very well balanced. It's going to be very skewed. But if you are talking to a real person and seeing their real life, you can't just abstract out, half of the world and say that's not important. It's like right in front of you. You have to confront that personhood. And I think in the same way, formation and discipleship works in that way. We can't just read a book. It's, reading and intellectual stuff is important, but that relational side is really where formation comes from. And what we say is oftentimes is formation is caught as much as it is taught. So
I just heard a quote from somewhere too that said, I don't remember where I heard it, but information is not transformation.
Yes.
I think that's exactly where you're at.
Yeah, perfect. Pastor Jay, you want to jump in for as well?
Yeah, just really briefly, I agree with what you guys said, so I'll kind of lean on that. But I think this period has had exactly the opposite effect on me, and I wouldn't be surprised if it the same for other people, where it's become very apparent to me during this period just how important presence is and just how important the gathering is. Not that, I mean, even though we're able to do so much like through technology and stuff like that, and there are genuine communities that are formed online without necessarily the physical presence piece, and I wouldn't want to discount that. But at least for me and my experience, even though we're still able to do and have so much of what we kind of typically would expect from church or whatever online, the presence is so important, and I definitely want to be able to have that piece. And so I would imagine that a lot of people have the same experience. I still think it is possible that even when this is over, like that some people maybe wouldn't kind of really jump on rejoining kind of like gathering physically with people, but I don't think it would be because they didn't recognize that it was important, but maybe you just get into habits and like just the expending the energy, or maybe even just hangover from the pandemic. Like you're so used to staying home that it's a little scary and it takes some time to like get back out there. So I can imagine that happening, but I have a hard time believing that people in this time have not come to the realization like I have, just how important and just how much we miss being able to gather together with other people. It's like a long distance relationship.
Yeah.
It's not like it can't work, but I don't want to do it forever. And that's definitely how I feel.
And I think that ties really well with what Matt was talking about, how important it is to be personally invested. I mean, if you're not invested in a relationship, there's only so far that you can go. And a lot of times when we look at discipleship, when we look at our relationship with God, when we look at church, a lot of times we're unknowingly looking for shortcuts in discipleship, or as pastors, maybe we're looking for shortcuts to kind of grow our church, to get more butts and seats, and this idea of like, if I just find the right technique, if I use the right technology, if I say the right things, then people will come and then automatically be discipled. But I think the theme that's emerging from this conversation is that Christian discipleship, it's not about efficiency. Christian discipleship is probably one of the most inefficient processes you can think of. So if we have this mentality of, well, I could just do this online because it's easier, wouldn't that be better for everyone? You're like, no, it also works where it's like, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. If you just fill yourself with, spiritual fast food and you're kind of not investing into it, you're not going to produce very mature believers. And I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer also talks about how Christian discipleship is costly. I mean, when you think about Jesus, I mean, it costed him his life. He had to die on the cross, and that's a model for how we should go as well, So, um, and part of the cost is being present, but it's also part of the benefit and part of the blessedness. And it's about that long-term accompaniment, not only that we receive from the Lord, but that we get to take part in each other. Okay, so why don't I pause here and let me, I think we're probably running out of time, so we may not have time for a breakout discussion this week, which is totally cool because I really enjoyed that conversation. But what I still want to do is ask you all to consider these questions, not only right now, but in the upcoming weeks. So, here are the discussion questions we would have had. Over the last 3 Sundays, when we talked about disconnection with God, disconnection with church, and disconnection with self, so evidently I was disconnected with myself. I didn't even finish that sentence at that moment. What stood out to you the most during these last 3-4 weeks on Sundays? And then the second question was, how have you struggled and been working through disconnection this past year? And then last, what comments, reflections, or follow-up questions might you have for the panel or for the rest of the church? So, unfortunately, we may not have space to kind of speak them out loud, but whether you're on Zoom or whether you're on Facebook, definitely want to invite you to maybe write them down and share it and bless the rest of our community by writing them down and typing them on chat, either on Facebook or on Zoom. I'm just going to write these questions down on the Facebook Zoom as well. And as they come, maybe if I can ask Pastor Jay Wu, for you to kind of interrupt the conversation and kind of interject some of these comments and questions, because we'd love to incorporate you all into this discussion as well. But for now, maybe while we're waiting for some of you to provide us some input, I can kind of pivot to our last question that we had prepared for this morning. And this last question had to do, it reads as follows. So, Dave, in your Sunday sermon, you mentioned that formation is impossible when we are disconnected with ourselves, and that dissociation is a common symptom of chronic stress and burnout. And one of the signs of burnout, in addition to, depersonalization, lack of personal accomplishment, is something that really resonated, like emotional exhaustion. And I mean, that is something that is pervasive. I know many people in our congregation, many people in our communities are really wearing that hat of emotional exhaustion. And, I carry that with me, and I feel like it has effects on my physical body, and my physical wellness, as well as my emotional well-being. What are some initial action steps that we can take to respond to these signs or symptoms of burnout when we notice them or when other people recognize them in us? And how can those initial steps lead us to connection with self and ultimately healthy spiritual formation? So that can be a whole series of sermon series, but let me just respond with a few thoughts on that. First of all, just to affirm and validate that, it's always still so amazing to me when I see how interconnected all the different parts of us are. When I think of our emotional life, when I think of our relational life, when I think about our spiritual life, and even when I think of my physical health, all of these things are interconnected. So when they're not in harmony, a lot of times that disharmony is going to spill over and over into one or many or all of those facets. And I won't go into the details, but I had struggled with a 6 to 8 year season of my life where I felt disconnected from God, and somewhat disconnected from church as well. And I still carry the physical symptoms from that season of life, like in the form of, I have really bad stomach acid, and up until the last 4 or 5 months, I've been going into holistic medicine. I affirm both Western medicine as well as holistic kind of Eastern traditional medicine. And one of the things I've been working on the last 4 or 5 months is weaning myself off of all Western medication, because I've been on like these drugs to control my stomach acid for literally over 10 years. And the last 2, 3 months, I've been finally weaned off of them. I don't take any of them anymore, and I feel a lot healthier because of it. But the reason why I was in there in the first place was actually because of a spiritual emotional problem 8 to 10 years ago. And I feel like now that I'm kind of further along in my recovery process, this last dimension I didn't give enough attention to is like the physical side and how it impacts my spirit, my physical health. And I won't talk too much about it because I know we're running out of time, but in my case, and I'm not going to say this is going to be true for all cases, it actually related very well with what you shared about, Matt, where a lot of my anger, a lot of my physical problems came from the emotional hurt and pain that in turn came from just these really hurtful church experiences that I came out of about 10, 15 years ago. And because I had some really perhaps imbalanced theological beliefs, I was actually really angry at God, and didn't let myself be angry at God. You know, I was also really angry at other people. In some ways, I was even angry at myself. But because I had a certain view of myself, like it didn't give me permission to actually feel any of those things. Like I was in grief, but as Pastor Jay was sharing, like unlike him earlier this year, I wasn't allowing myself to grieve. And if you allow this thing to kind of carry on for years and years and end, and unfortunately, a lot of us do this, it does begin to leak out in many forms. So for me, really the first steps has been related to grief, you know, and some of the themes in my grief that have been really helpful for me even to today included thoughts, you know, accepting thoughts like, you know, the world is not what I thought it was. I really wish it was a certain way, but it's not. You know, other people are not who I thought they were, even though I really wish they would. You know, sometimes this is a really tough pill to swallow. And perhaps even more difficult is 3, I am not the person that I thought I was. I'm not as spiritually mature. I'm not as calm. I'm not as whatever, fill in the blank, not as loving. And if I'm willing to go there, that is me saying I'm willing to reconnect with where I'm at right now, even in my mess. You know, I can be human. I can be right here where I am. And granted, it's not going to be where I'm going to be for the rest of my life, but it is where I'm at right now. And I found paradoxically, the more you resist it, the more you're going to get stuck in it, and the more it's going to be prolonged. But if I'm willing to face and go acknowledge, you know, this is actually as much as I wish it wasn't the case. If this is actually where I'm at, and this is where I've been, that actually is a real key to getting ourselves unstuck from it in the long run. So whether that might involve conversations with other people, conversations with yourself, and I would even say conversations with God. So if you happen to be struggling with anger with God, that's probably one link in a long chain. So you're not only struggling with God, you're probably struggling with yourself and struggling with others as well. But maybe struggles with God can be a place you can start. Maybe you can start off by talking about your anger at God in prayer, and trust that God can contain that he's mature enough not to, like, you know, zap a bolt of lightning and make you disintegrate. I know he's not that kind of God, you know, but we feel like he is that way. But having a real conversation with him, not as one who just hangs out in the group, like Pastor Jay said, but as a person that you actually have a direct relationship with.